This is going to be a much more practical session than what we've had this morning. It's going through three cases of children who I have seen in my practice and showing you how this biomedical approach works. I'm going to talk about a case of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, a child with depression, and one with oppositional and defiant behavior. And what I'm going to go through is how do they present, what are the parents' main concerns, what do I look for in the history, like what Woody mentioned today, that, for example, neonatal asphyxia, some problems at birth can cause problems later in life. So those are the kind of clues we're looking for. Then what do I look for in the examination? What lab tests do I order, if any, and what the treatment looks like. So I'm going to start with obsessive compulsive behavior. About 2 to 3% of children present with this problem, and the typical onset is about 7 to 12 years. I saw a 10-year-old boy who had a 3-month history of a sudden onset of obsessive hand washing and fear of contamination. He was very, very scared of bacteria, HIV, all kinds of contamination. And he also had at the same time a change in behavior, very easily frustrated. He had been a really sweet, easygoing child before that. And he had become aggressive, which was very untypical for him. He started biting his clothes and his hands. He was anxious and sad, and he also didn't sleep very well. The other interesting thing the mom mentioned right away was that his bowel motions had changed. They'd become mushy and smelly. And of course, a big topic right now in mental health is the gut flora and the connection that we have from the gut flora to the brain. So in the history, I asked for any problems in the pregnancy. Did the mom take any medications? None. The birth had been at term, full-term birth, but there had been some failure to progress, so possibly a little bit of hypoxia, and the child was born by C-section. The interesting thing about C-section, of course, one big reason I asked for is because of the gut flora. When a child is born vaginally, the normal, natural way, they get the mom's gut flora on the way out. If they're born by C-section, they miss out on that. Their first gut flora will be skin flora or hospital flora, which are both not what we expect in a baby's gut. Then the baby luckily was breastfed for 9 months. So that's, well, it wasn't long enough, but at least 9 months. And we know that breast milk promotes the growth of really good gut bacteria. But, so he stopped breastfeeding at 9 months, and surprise, surprise, at 10 months he started having ear infections, which were treated with antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are a lifesaver, and sometimes we really do need them, but a lot of antibiotics are prescribed unnecessarily, in particular for ear infections. We've had research out now for 20 years that shows that 95% of ear infections go away without antibiotics just as fast as with antibiotics. But the difference is if you give an antibiotic, you're twice as likely to have another ear infection within 3 months. So you get into that pattern of one ear infection after another. So if you have babies or if you're friends with babies who get ear infections, just tell them there are other things they can do to get over the infection, and it will go away. You know, I mean, there is a very small percentage of complicated ear infections that have to be treated with antibiotics, but it's a tiny percentage. Now then, from about 2 years, so he was already falling into that kind of not great immune system. From about 2 years, he had had recurrent throat infections. So that often happens. The kids start out with ear infections, get antibiotics, then start having throat infections. And again, he was treated with antibiotics. With throat infections, if there truly are streptococcal throat infections, I agree that antibiotics are probably a good thing. But a lot of throat infections are viral or other bacteria that don't need to be treated. At 4 years of age, he had his tonsils taken out. And apart from that, his development had been fine, and he really never had any learning problems or behavior problems. So when I looked at him in my office, he was very quiet, unusually quiet for a child. Pale, he had dark circles under the eyes, and he had what we call keratosis pilaris. That's that dry, bumpy skin that feels like sandpaper on the upper arms, and that's a sign of low omega-3. His tummy was fine, heart examination, lungs, all of that was fine. So then I think of a differential diagnosis. Okay, what could be causing a sudden onset of obsessive compulsive behavior, mood changes, and mushy bowel motions? And one of the first things that comes to my mind there is PANDAS, okay, pediatric autoimmune neurological disease associated with strep. And you all heard Gabby reading out her story this morning, and that is kind of what she has, those symptoms. The other thing I think of is it may not be PANDAS, it may not be the full-blown autoimmune disease, but it may be that the child has an overgrowth of streptococci in their gut, because if you look at stool samples from many different people, if you send it to a really good lab like the BioScreen lab in Melbourne, they can actually look at the culture, what is growing in the gut, and they can say, this is a child with anxiety, this is a person with brain fog, this is a child with hyperactivity, and this is a child who's aggressive. That's how specific they can be. They're not always right, but in general, you have that correlation. And in particular, with anxiety and OCD, we see streptococci. The other thing I think of is magnesium deficiency. Now, the chicken and the egg, we don't know what comes first, but if you are low in magnesium, for example, because you don't eat a great diet, because you're not eating enough green leafy vegetables and nuts and seeds, if you don't have enough magnesium, you have magnesium deficiency symptoms, and those symptoms are anxiety, tics. You can have little muscle tics. You know, a lot of adults even get little muscles that just have these little involuntary movements, or actual tics, you know, where the kid goes like that. And constipation is another symptom of magnesium deficiency, and sore legs. So magnesium is very important for all your muscles, every muscle in the body. In kids, we very often hear that they have growing pains, sore legs after they've been running a lot. And I always say to parents, growing doesn't hurt. What it is, it's magnesium deficiency. And these kids are sometimes as active as an athlete. And when athletes run a marathon or do major exercise, they take magnesium afterwards because they know their muscles need the extra magnesium to be able to relax. The heart is another muscle that needs magnesium a lot. And now in Europe, for example, in Germany, everybody takes magnesium because they know it's going to be good for their heart, their blood pressure will come down, they live longer. Women in pregnancy take magnesium because they know it reduces their risk of premature labor. So magnesium is a big, in addition to the zinc and B6 we've been talking about a lot this morning, I would add in magnesium as one of the really, really important nutrients that a lot of us are lacking. The other thing I'm thinking in the differential diagnosis is toxins. Was this child exposed to toxins? So what could that be? That could be that the father took Roundup and sprayed it all around the house, you know, around the garden, because he wanted to get rid of the weeds. And Roundup is very, very toxic, of course. There's lots of research on that, but a lot of people still use it, unfortunately. It can affect your nervous system. It can affect your gut flora. And when you are exposed to toxins, you suddenly drop in glutathione and zinc and all the things your body uses to quickly detoxify. And that all can then affect your immune system. Another commonly used toxin is fly sprays. Yeah, I always recommend to throw it out. If you have a fly spray in your house, don't use it. It's highly neurotoxic. It actually paralyzes the flies and kills them. But in children, of course, they're much bigger than a fly, so it doesn't have the immediate killing effect, but it accumulates in their brain and in their fatty tissues and does affect them in a negative way. Stress is another factor I always ask about, you know, because as people have mentioned this morning, Woody, for example, psychological stress is as bad for the brain as a toxin. It causes the same kind of oxidative stress and then puts in the same cascade of immune changes. And we know that if you're not happy, if you're stressed, your immune system, you get sick more often, okay, and you're more susceptible to infections. So I ordered some lab tests for this child. I ordered antibodies to streptococci because I was thinking of that as one of the potential reasons why this child is so anxious and OCD. And his antibodies to strep were very elevated. He also had low zinc, he had low iron stores, the ferritin, low vitamin D. And another test we could have done is that BioScreen test, stool test that I talked about, where people actually culture the poo and see what's growing in it. But for us to do that from New Zealand is quite expensive, so we didn't do it. But if we'd been here, we would have. So now I knew that this child has a problem with streptococci. Okay, he has high antibodies to strep. He has a sudden onset of a change in his mood and behavior with OCD, and that is PANDAS. So I treated it. The question is, do you start a child like this on antibiotics? If I have a bioscreen stool test that shows me that this child has like 90% streptococci growing in their gut, then I do use antibiotics because I want to get rid of that really fast. If I don't have the clear proof, sometimes I'm a bit more tentative and I use some herbal drops, but they can be very, very effective as well. It's a mix of different herbs that kill off streptococci. I also gave that child some zinc because he was low on zinc, and zinc is very, very important for your frustration tolerance, your immune system, and your brain processing connections. Iron, because he was low on iron, very, very important for your brain as well, and for your energy. Vitamin D, incredibly important for your immune system, okay? In the winter in Auckland, I don't know about Sydney, but I imagine it's not that different. In Auckland, 90% of children are vitamin D deficient in the winter. And that we still have lots of sunny days, not as many as you do have, but it's not too bad. But the sun is at an angle this far south of the equator where it just doesn't produce vitamin D in the skin. And in the countries in Northern Europe that are as far away from the equator as we are here, every child gets vitamin D in the winter, okay? Because the public health people there know how important it is for your immune system, for your mood, lots of different things. So I got his vitamin D up and I give him some omega-3, so the good fatty acids, which are, I'll go a little bit through in more detail about what they do, and magnesium, also to help with the sleep, and melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone that we produce at night in our brain that makes us sleepy, and it is natural, it's safe, even at small doses, and I usually use the smallest dose that works for the shortest time that is needed. But it is often a lifesaver because sleep is incredibly important for your immune system. If you don't sleep enough, you will get sick, and you don't recover as quickly from an infection like this one. So PANDAS or PANS. PANS is exactly the same thing, but not caused by strep, caused by other bacteria or even viruses. So a little bit more vague. We don't know exactly what is causing it. But up to 25% of children who present with obsessive compulsive disorder or obsessive compulsive behavior actually have this autoimmune reaction. And you usually find the elevated streptococcal antibodies, the acute onset of changes, and very often you have a history of the child either having had a sore throat or maybe a nose infection or an ear infection, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes they had these infections years before. And what we think that's happening there is that they still have some of these streptococci in their body, but most of them have been killed by the antibiotics that they've been given for their sore throat. Some become resistant and they sit in the gut and grow there. And so some change, so for example, stress, or maybe just a diet really high in sugar, those streptococci start overgrowing, and then the immune system starts overreacting. So it can happen later on. The antibodies against streptococci actually cause a leaking blood-brain barrier. So that blood-brain barrier is supposed to protect our brain from all kinds of toxins and bad things that are in our blood. But if you have this very strong antibody response, it puts little holes in that blood-brain barrier. I've given you some more biochemical explanations of what's happening. But the way it's treated is with antibiotics usually. And a pretty long course of antibiotics. It's a bit like rheumatic fever, if any of you have heard of that. If you have a streptococcal infection, sometimes the same kind of antibody response can affect the heart. And these children are treated with long-term antibiotics for months and months, and then they're on prophylactic antibiotics once a week or twice a week for years to avoid the streptococci from regrowing and causing more damage to the heart. And it's very similar to the PANDAS, just it's the brain, not the heart. Another treatment option in children who don't respond to that can be an intravenous immunoglobulin. Now this is very expensive and very invasive. You know, it's pooled immunoglobulin from hundreds and hundreds of donors, so it comes with some risks. It's screened, but it's not very easily available or readily available in New Zealand. I don't know about here, but I understand that there are some children who have had it here, but difficult to arrange. It's sometimes magical in its response because that kind of takes those antibodies actually out of the blood. Plasmapheresis does the same thing as like a clearing of the blood. They go in and take out the antibodies. And I've given you the website there, the pandasnetwork.org, which is a fantastic website if you're interested in pandas, or if you know anyone who has these kinds of symptoms, I would urge you to look at it. It's fantastic. And I've given you the names of some of the main researchers in this area. So I'll go a little bit more into detail about how we treat those streptococci. Here are some of the herbs that actually can work against streptococci, or the penicillin or azithromycin. Some people use injected penicillin because it only has to be given once a month, but of course it's a bit painful. So you're killing off the strep, but at the same time, you have to fill up the body with good bacteria. Because whenever you get rid of some bad bacteria, there's going to be a niche, and that's going to be filled up with some other bad bacteria if you don't give good ones. And the main one that we see that kids who have high streptococci are lacking is E. coli. So in the gut flora, we look at aerobic gut flora and anaerobic. Aerobic is the one that those bacteria grow really well with oxygen. And the predominant bacteria there should be E. coli. You should have like 90 to 95% E. coli, and then a tiny bit of streptococci, maybe enterococcus, maybe a little bit of yeast, but small amounts. You have different kinds, not just one, but mostly E. coli. What happens in the kids where we have done bioscreen stool tests who had pandas, it was exactly the opposite. They had 95% streptococci and maybe 5% E. coli. So reducing those streptococci will help, but only temporarily, otherwise they start regrowing. So you have to give that E. coli. Now luckily, you can buy E. coli in capsules. So it's called Mutaflor and is available, for example, from one of the compounding pharmacies that is here. And works really, really well. E. coli produces tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin, which is a calming neurotransmitter. Okay, so it really calms these kids down, makes them happier at the same time as you're reducing the streptococci. Other probiotics that may help are Bifidobacter or delactate-free acidophilus. You just heard Dr. Anthony Underwood explaining why we need the delactate-free one, because these kids often already have a lot of acidosis. So there are other probiotics that they may need, but you need to give them also a very, very good diet. Okay, a diet that promotes the growth of the good gut flora. So that's lots of fresh vegetables and legumes and no sugar. Very important. Streptococci thrive on sugar. They love sugar. And even fruit sugar. So we restrict even fruit for a while. You know, I always feel kind of weird saying that you shouldn't have any fruit, because of course fruit are healthy. But in kids with very high streptococci counts, sometimes they have to avoid fruit for a couple of months, and then we go back. And the other thing to remember is that a lot of kids are actually inversing what they should do. They should have at least 5 servings of vegetables a day and 2 of fruit. Now, a lot of kids do the opposite. They have 5 servings of fruit and only 2 of vegetables. So you really want to get that balance right. And the 5 plus of vegetables. You can easily have 10 servings of vegetables. That's healthier than 5, okay? But you want to get at least 5 to 5. And a serving is the size of their fist. So remember that. So now I'm going to go through a few supplements that I put this chart on just to give you an idea of what they do, and some dosages which are not so important for you, but in case you want to, you should always do this under the supervision of a clinician, of course. So iron, incredibly important for brain development, for energy, mood, and sleep. We have lots of research that children with sleep problems respond well to getting their iron to an optimal level, mood as well. If a child is iron deficient in the first year of life, and this is not corrected, their brain will never reach the same outcome, optimal learning, as a child who hasn't been iron deficient. So it is really important. In America, where I did my pediatric training, we tested every child sometime between 6 months and 12 months for iron deficiency, because it is so common and it is so easily treated. You can increase the absorption of your iron by taking it with vitamin C. And there are good plant sources for vitamin C, for iron. We know that vegetarians are no more likely to be iron deficient than non-vegetarians, but you just have to eat it. You have to either have your red meat, or you have to have legumes, dark green vegetables, or enriched cereals. So you need iron in your diet every single day. Magnesium, and usually given as a combination with B6, it's particularly powerful. If you're low in magnesium, you feel anxious, you have nightmares, you have sleep problems, you wake up in the night or you can't go to sleep, you can have those muscle twitches and sore legs, and you can have sensory issues. A lot of our children have sensory issues, so they get overwhelmed by too much noise, they hold their ears, bright lights, they can't stand too many people around them, crowds, or the labels on their clothes, or the itchy clothes, and all kinds of the socks are not right. Each child has their own, but that can improve if you give a good dose of magnesium. And then, of course, constipation, because the muscles are not working well. Now, if you give magnesium, you have children who are less hyperactive, less aggressive, and have better attention. And you can give magnesium in your diet, so black beans, pumpkin seeds, other nuts and seeds, spinach, halibut, whole grain cereals are all very, very good sources of magnesium. About 60% of Australians are magnesium deficient. So that's either because they're not eating these foods or because they need more. So a lot of people actually take a supplement. And there are lots of good magnesium supplements. Do not take magnesium oxide. Okay, they sometimes call that heavy magnesium. That's the magnesium that doesn't get absorbed. That's the magnesium that stays in your gut and helps you if you're constipated. We want another kind of magnesium, either chelated or citrate or aspartate or taurate, any other kind of magnesium, or orotate. They get absorbed into the body much, much better. And here I have taurine, because magnesium with taurine is particularly good for children who have anxiety and tics and OCD behavior. Taurine is very essential for cardiovascular function, but also the muscles again and the CNS. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it calms you down. And it can protect against glutamate neurotoxicity. So if you paid attention today, there was a lot of talk about glutamate receptors. So certain foods like MSG increase your glutamate, and if you take taurine, it can reduce that toxicity. Anxiolytic effect makes you less anxious, and it is sometimes used for preventing seizures. So it can have such a powerful effect on the CNS, on the central nervous system. Now, how do we give magnesium? There's another way. If your children really, really don't want to take something by mouth, you can give them an Epsom salt bath. That is magnesium sulfate, and it's really readily absorbed through the skin. Now, I'm talking about vitamin D, and I actually already mentioned most of this. I just want to say that if the lower your vitamin D, the more infections you get, the more asthma, the more eczema. And we supplement it usually with a daily little drop. Has to be the right dose, as too small a dose doesn't do it. A lifeguard in Australia who spends his day on the beach easily makes 20,000 units in one day. Okay, so it's a pretty big dose. We wouldn't want to give a child 20,000 every day, but 1,000 units a day, depending on the weight, 2,000 is very safe. And that is a better way of giving a daily dose, rather than giving the high dose supplements that we can buy given once a month. So the research on the high dose supplements doesn't show the same kind of beneficial effect. Essential fatty acids, very, very important for your brain, your mood, also your skin and your eyes, and even for your hormones and your immune system. Now, once again, the symptoms are that sandpaper rash on the upper arms, cradle cap in younger kids, or coarse hair, dandruff, soft fingernails, and the dose you want to give a really, really good dose, but start slow with any of these supplements. Start with a small dose and slowly go up. But 1,000 milligrams of omega-3 is a pretty good dose. Some kids need more. And if they do well on 1,000 milligrams, I often say go up as fast as you can until the skin is no longer bumpy, and then you can reduce the dose again. So the different sorts of omega-3 we get is fish oil. Now, if you buy fish oil, you have to make sure it's mercury-free. A lot of fish oils say mercury tested, and that's tricking you because they don't give you the test result. There are only a few brands that actually say 100% mercury-free, and those are the brands I would go for. I actually wouldn't go for fish oil anymore, and the trend in the market is to get away from that because you need like 20 kilos of fish to make 20 milliliters of fish oil or something like that. It's not quite as much, but it's a huge amount of wastage of fish wasted to make this fish oil. and then you have to molecularly distill it to get rid of all the toxins in it. So krill oil is highly concentrated and comes from the tiny, tiny little krill that the fish eat to actually get their mercury as well, but their omega-3. But you can even go a step further, and you can take algae oil. And that is organically produced, very environmentally friendly, doesn't have any mercury in it because it is so low on the food chain. And it is really the future. When, 10 years ago we had one algae oil on the market, and now I think we have 5, 6, or 7, and there is a new one coming out every few months. And it is still quite expensive, but with more competition, it will come down in price. And I'm sure in another 10 years, everybody will be taking algae oil because it is so much more environmentally friendly. And our oceans will be empty. There won't be any more fish. Okay, now this boy on these supplements, I saw him a few times. I didn't see him just 2 months later, but I'm giving you what happened, how he was 2 months later. He was much, much better. He had stopped the hand washing. His anxiety had decreased over time, and his behavior was much more settled, and the aggression was gone. He was getting back to his normal self. He was in a good mood. His sleep was great, and we then kept him on a maintenance dose of the supplements, especially the zinc, to keep his immune system strong, his magnesium probiotics, and streptococcal drops, and so that we kept him on for quite a while. And all of those supplements that I mentioned there for the maintenance actually quite safe to give in the long term. You can overdose on some of them, but if you're careful and you don't put them on a too high a dose, they're actually good. And zinc is so incredibly important while you're growing. You need more zinc when you're growing, and children, of course, are growing by definition. And our soils in New Zealand, I am pretty sure that's true for Australia as well, are very, very low in zinc. So even if you eat an excellent diet, you're probably not getting enough zinc from your diet. Now, for adults, that's fine because we're already grown. We don't need as much. Probably need a bit more than we're getting from our diet. But children need it desperately. And just as Woody said, teenagers with acne, zinc deficiency. And what are the other symptoms teenagers typically get? They get grumpy and irritable, zinc deficiency, and they get stretch marks. Okay, so very, very important to give these kids, my teenagers, I promise you, they're on very high doses of zinc, and they're perfectly neurotypical, but I want an easy life. Okay, so now from this first case on to depression. So there's a 5% prevalence. It's quite high. If you think of, 100 kids in a school, 5% of them, 5 are going to be depressed at some point. It's increasing worldwide, and is actually considered to be one of the big public health problems of the future. This was an older adolescent. He was 16, and he had a 3-month history of just low moods, not wanting to eat anything, trouble sleeping, lack of motivation. He had actually he used to work out and play sports. He'd stopped all of that. Just didn't feel like it anymore. And it really didn't do much at all. Just wanted to sit around and mope. Not feeling well. In the history, the one big assessment we do for teenagers is called a HEADS assessment, and that goes through the home and environment, education, employment, activities, alcohol. You see the whole list, asking about all these things because they can all give you clues to why this child is depressed. Now, of course, you can be depressed just purely because of something bad happening in your life. You don't need to have a mineral deficiency or something. You're probably more resilient if you're in perfect health. And we know that some people deal really well with things going badly in their life and others don't. So the risk factors for teenage depression are, of course, trauma, stress, conflict, abuse, things we always need to ask for about. Medications, Roaccutane. So most doctors who see an adolescent with acne don't think zinc. They think Roaccutane, and that has, as a major side effect, can cause depression. But also benzodiazepines, Ritalin can cause depression, and we know that a high percentage, or not a high percentage, but quite a lot of young people are on Ritalin and other medications for ADHD. Then, of course, drugs and alcohol, and that is the high-risk age for experimenting and having them. And there is what we call the invisible group of teenagers with depression. They're the kids who don't really have had major trauma or not drinking alcohol, and they're not on any drugs, but they're the ones who just don't get enough sleep. They have a sedentary lifestyle, they don't exercise, and they have a high media use. So these are the kids who spend hours and hours a day on computers or games instead of sleeping and instead of exercising. And that is a whole group that's coming out. I gave you the link there for a research study that came out this year that identified that this is now the new group of kids that's coming up with depression. Another risk factor is vitamin D deficiency. So you've all heard about seasonal affective disorder, SAD. That's when people get sad in the winter. It affects adults as well as adolescents and children. And then other nutritional deficiencies that affect the mood. So zinc, omega-3, you already know that. You can sing along with me. These are the ICD-10 criteria for major depressive episodes. The key symptoms, so the key symptoms we know, they're just not happy. They're very unhappy and low energy. But the associated symptoms are interesting. Sleep problems, appetite, no concentration, poor self-confidence, all this you can rate the child with this list and see how severe the depression is. Now, the history in this child was, once again, an uneventful pregnancy, a normal birth. He was actually really healthy as a toddler and child, but in the year before, he had had recurrent colds. And he had the flu in the winter. So flu, if it's really influenza, I think low vitamin D, okay? And mild acne. What do we think? Yeah. So he was in the middle of school examinations, which is stressful. And he was applying for university, which was even more stressful for him, okay? He was going to go overseas, so very hard. And he had low energy, and he'd stopped exercising. So there was that invisible group partly there. On examination, he really had a blunt effect. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't, not much expression. Normal speech, was very pale and quite thin, so he hadn't eaten much. Had white spots on the fingernails, zinc, and the rest of the examination was normal. And then I ordered some lab tests, and I had, of course, done a head assessment, and this child didn't really have any major risk factors apart from the school stress. His investigation showed most things normal, apart from vitamin D deficiency and a very low zinc. Okay, those were the two things that stood out for him. And then I started him on a biomedical treatment. And people sometimes ask, so why would you even do that? Why would you do biomedical treatment and not just give that child a drug, an SSRI? Why don't you put that child on Prozac? And the reason I would say is because Prozac, first of all, those SSRIs don't address the cause. If this child is zinc and vitamin D deficient, they're highly correlated with low mood and depression, so I want to fix that because now I know that is a problem. SSRIs don't. Secondly, SSRIs have side effects. Getting your level of vitamin D and zinc to good levels doesn't have any negative side effects. It has positive side effects. One of the side effects of SSRIs in adolescence is suicide. So we have a whole subgroup of young people who actually don't get better, but worse. They kill themselves. And then also, we have a whole new body of research to show that SSRIs actually do not work any better than placebo. There are lots of studies on that. And what happened is, this is a bit of an aside, but what happened is that the pharmaceutical companies were publishing the data on studies that showed that a drug worked better than a placebo. It usually wasn't much better, but maybe 10% better or 20% better. And so that's what the FDA and other countries use to allow these drugs on the market. But then some other researchers used the Freedom of Information Act and actually asked for all the studies that had been done by the pharmaceutical companies and other people on these SSRIs. And there were many, many studies that had never been published. And when they took all the studies together, they showed that there was no difference between a placebo and an SSRI. But we still think, because 10 years ago we were told they work better than a placebo, we still have that kind of in our collective brains that they work. But they really, the research shows they don't. They work in some people with very, very severe depression. They can work a little bit better than a placebo. And when I talk about that, people say, yeah, but I took one and I felt immediately better. I said, yeah, but if you'd been given a placebo, probably the same thing would have happened. And the placebo wouldn't have given you the headaches and all the other side effects that you had to deal with afterwards. So, sometimes I feel we should have little placebo pills we could sell what we can. Okay, so this child, a young adolescent, I put him on vitamin D because he's vitamin D deficient. I put him on some iron because his ferritin was suboptimal. So below 40 is not optimal. For really good brain function, you want above 40 or 50. I gave him some methyl B12. So his B12 was kind of low normal once again. And methyl B12 is the B12 that goes very easily into the brain, so where you need it. I also put this boy on something called SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine. And that's kind of my alternative to medications. It's natural. It's methionine, which is an amino acid we all eat in our diet. But those of us who do the methylation process really well methylate the methionine into SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine. Some people, for whatever reason, maybe because they don't have enough methyl B12, or maybe because they have a bit of a gene snip, or because they've been exposed to some toxins, they don't do this very well. So giving them that SAMe just makes them feel better. It is one of the building blocks for the neurotransmitters that we need in our brain to be happy. There are some, so 5-HTP is a precursor to serotonin, which is also a calming, happy neurotransmitter, and it can help you with sleep. So a lot of adolescents who don't sleep well, and they can respond really well to 5-HTP or melatonin. But if I have a lab result that shows that the child actually truly is low in serotonin, I would probably put them on 5-HTP, and it often makes them really calm and quite chilled out and happy. Zinc with B6, very, very important. So this child had the white spots on the nails, and he had a very low zinc on his blood test. So that was very important for him, and he had the acne. There are others, so together with the supplements, I always stress that they have to be on a good diet. And a good diet is unprocessed, lots and lots of fiber, vegetables, legumes, healthy, whole foods that your great-grandmother would actually recognize as food, not a package that you open and you add a little bit of water. Other therapeutic possibilities are light therapy. So that's used a lot in Europe now for people who have seasonal affective disorder. So they get vitamin D and they get the light therapy that gives them the light that the sunshine would give them, and it makes them happier. It does work. And I always think of how were we evolved. When we evolved, we actually evolved to live around the equator. And then we moved further and further away from the equator. And at the equator, you have 12 hours of sunshine every day. I mean, you have a bit of rain in the middle of the day for a couple of hours, but most of the time it's sunny and you have long days. And that's probably what we need. So if you get depressed in the winter, get yourself a good little light machine, a light box. And I also put them on probiotics because I'm aware of the connection between the gut flora and mood and mental health. And I think hardly anybody today has a really, really good gut flora. Very hard to find people with an optimal gut flora. And the reason is, once again, we started, saying the birth process, breastfeeding. Ideally, you should be breastfed exclusively for 6 months and then ongoing for at least 2 years. That's what we evolved to do and what we should do and what WHO and UNICEF recommend. And then you should eat a diet that is very healthy, that is unprocessed, low in sugar, with lots of vegetables. And how many people do that? And we shouldn't have antibiotics. As soon as you take antibiotics, you wipe out your good gut flora. And you should probably have some probiotics. You can have them in your diet as fermented foods, so kimchi, kefir, yogurt, all of those, sauerkraut are very healthy foods that give you probiotics. And most traditional diets have those in their diet, but we've lost that. Okay, so here's a little bit more about probiotics, and I think I've already said most of those things. As an adult, we have about 3 kilograms of gut bacteria in our gut. That's quite a lot. We have 100 trillion bacteria in our body, 10 times more than we have cells in our body. And those bacteria in the gut, they produce enzymes for digestion. So certain things we can't actually digest without having the right gut flora. They also make hormones. They make tryptophan, that precursor for serotonin. They produce even vitamins, like vitamin K is produced to a large part by the gut bacteria. And we know that an abnormal gut flora interferes with your immune system and can affect your mood. Okay, I've given you some references here. And now I'm going to talk about some lifestyle and psychological approaches to depression, because there's more you can do. So biomedical doesn't mean we just give a few supplements and some probiotics. We really think about the whole person. What do they need in their life to get well? So you need to address the stress. So this young person had stress at school, you address it. You know, maybe we can get some exemptions from exams, or we can get him some additional help so he feels more confident. You address any stress in the home, which is very fundamental. You know, if there is a negative energy at home and there's abusive parenting, so that needs to be addressed, because the child is not going to get better until you do that. You have to address trauma, and you can do that in lots of different ways, psychotherapy. Relaxation is a very wonderful way of helping children to just feel better, and there are lots of different ways of doing relaxation, guided imagery. You can download now little tapes from the internet or MP3s where they can just listen to it on their phone, and it just puts them into a relaxed state, and it is very, very important and helps. You know, just as stress increases oxidative stress, relaxation reduces oxidative stress in the brain. And when you have less oxidative stress, you'll feel happier, your brain is able to work better. And sleep. My children know that when they get sick, they have to go to bed. I tell them sleep is the best medicine for anything. And we know that sleep deprivation is a great torture method. Now, if you don't get to sleep enough, you're going to be unhappy, deeply unhappy. So this boy really needed to sleep more. And then exercise. Lots of research on exercise and depression. It helps. The intensity matters. You can't, I mean, in the beginning, if you're really very deeply depressed and unhappy, maybe you can just manage a walk. But as you can increase the intensity, it works better. Okay, now this is what I gave the boy, exactly. We talked about that already, so some supplements, but also exercise, an hour a day, okay? And so he was going back to weight training and soccer. And he actually loved it, and he was, as he got back into it, he felt much, much better. We also restricted the screen time to 2 hours per day, which I still feel is kind of a lot. But 16 years of, I mean, you're going to be very lucky if you can get a 16-year-old who spends less than 2 hours on a screen. So, but very, very important. I know it's a very difficult thing to do. I have 2 boys who are 12 and 17, and to get them off their screens is really a daily struggle, but I persevere because I know the research and how important it is. And I think if you can just start early on with being really clear what the limits are, and the limits should be none before 3 years of age. They really don't need to know how to work an iPhone before they're 3. From 3 to 5, half an hour, and then after 5, 1 hour, and from about 12 years, we go up to 2 hours because we know we can't keep them to 1 hour. And we know that the more screen time a child has before they're 3, the higher the risk that they're going to be ADHD. And the reason is that the brain just develops in a different way. If you spend hours and hours on screens, things move very fast on screens. You know, if you look at the computer games, I get actually dizzy when I look at what they're playing. I can't watch it. But even TV, cartoons move really fast. And your brain adapts to that. And if you do that for 3-4 hours a day, and then you go to school and you're supposed to sit there quietly while they show you how to draw an A, that's going to be very boring and very slow for you. So your brain just doesn't cope, okay? So very important to keep it down. Get rid of your TV. We don't need TV. Not an important educational tool. So this young boy was much improved actually within 10 days of doing this. And he was sleeping well. I think what worked the fastest was his sleep, the SAMe, and the exercise. Zinc, magnesium, B6, omega-3 all work, but they don't work within 10 days usually. It takes a little bit longer. Okay, so, but I put him on some things I knew would make a difference really quickly to just get him back on track, and then he had a long-term program. And he was fully recovered within 2 months and is on a maintenance supplement program of vitamin D, especially in the winter, zinc and a multivitamin, and that's all he needs. And he is happily at university overseas now, so it worked. Now the last case I'm going to talk about is oppositional and defiant behavior. I'm just going to check the time to make sure. Oh my goodness, I'm out. 15 minutes? Yes. Good, great, perfect. There's about a 6 to 10% prevalence of young children with oppositional undefined behavior. And I get more and more parents coming to me with that complaint. So it used to be autism, ADHD, and I mean, I see a lot of kids with that still, but more and more parents are really just worried about their kids' behavior. They're getting into trouble at school, they're angry, they're difficult, they make life at home really difficult. The whole family kind of goes by the mood of the child. You know, the child is angry, nobody's happy, and it causes a lot of stress to the parents and the siblings. So I saw an 8-year-old boy. He was aggressive, violent at school and with his siblings. He pushed children and adults around, throwing things. He also had times when he was perfectly fine, but he had these explosions very quickly. At the slightest frustration, when he didn't get something he wanted, he just lost it. And very non-compliant, so you'd ask him to do something, he said, I'm not going to do that. You're not the boss of me. And very hard for the parents. They were lovely parents, and they had done positive parenting, and just didn't work very well for them. Well, they hadn't actually done the formal training, but they thought they were doing positive parenting. But they, of course, lost it as well, because they just got pushed to their limits. And he had lots of tantrums. Now, he had been difficult and demanding since he was 3 years old. Before that, he was probably okay, but the parents had been quite easy with him and given him a lot of things that he wanted. But from 3, they noticed that it was really getting more and more difficult, and they were exhausted. His moods dictated the mood of the family, and he was about to be suspended from school, and that's why they came. That was kind of the last straw. About his health, he had recurrent colds. Every single virus that went around, he caught it. And he had infected skin sores, which we call cellulitis or boils. And actually lots of open sores on his legs from mosquito bites that just didn't heal. His sleep was fine. Appetite, he was picky. He was eating mainly carbs, pasta with tomato sauce, tomato and cheese sandwiches, lollies, pizza, craving apples and bananas. And his parents had noted that he did become hyperactive after he ate orange lollies or chips, the orange chips with the 102, the color that has been really well studied and shown to be making kids hyperactive and difficult. Now, with a child like that, I think, just as Woody said, for teenager with acne, we think zinc. A child who gets sick a lot, who has skin healing problems and skin infections, a picky appetite, and lots of infections, zinc, and a low frustration tolerance. So his lab results showed a very low zinc, and his copper was elevated. Now, zinc and copper go like a seesaw. They should be in balance. When the zinc goes down, the copper goes up. And what the low zinc does is it gives you a low frustration tolerance. So if things don't go your way, you don't like it. But the high copper makes you explosive. So that's your outburst. And as you give zinc, the copper actually comes down. His iron was fine. He didn't have any lead. I usually check lead in kids who are quite angry and explosive, because that is one of the toxins we know can cause that kind of behavior. His mercury was a little bit high, but within what we call normal in New Zealand. But New Zealand is really very unusual about mercury levels. So their normal level used to be up to 20. And then we had so many children who had levels of 25, 30, 35 that the government decided to change the levels to 0 to 50 as normal. So now we have a lot of kids who have normal mercury, but have problems. And we know that mercury, just as lead, there is no safe level. Okay? The only acceptable level is 0. You don't want mercury. Mercury is highly toxic. It's the most toxic element apart from radioactive plutonium. Okay? So you don't want that in your diet, and you don't want it in your body. This child also had antibodies to gluten that were elevated. He didn't have celiac disease, so he didn't have what we call the tissue transglutaminase, which is the actual antibodies that cross-react with your gut and cause celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease caused by exposure to gluten. And gluten is in wheat, barley, and rye. But he had antibodies that were elevated. Now, we didn't do the MOV factor because he didn't have access to that in New Zealand, but it would have been interesting to know in this child. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about zinc. First of all, I want you to all check your fingernails and see if you have any white spots. And if you do have white spots, you are very zinc deficient. The typical presentations for low zinc are the low frustration tolerance. Oh no, now I'm going to talk about typical presentations of kids with behavior problems, with these type of behavior problems. Now this doesn't mean that every child who has this problem will have the behavior, but typically if you have low zinc, your frustration tolerance is low. These are the kids, if you take something away from them or if you don't let them have something, they just immediately get annoyed and angry. If they have high copper as well, explosive behavior, huge tantrums. If they have high mercury, very often they have rapid mood changes. So we have that word mercurial that describes it well. And they also often chew their clothes. Okay, so the kids who chew you have to buy new school uniforms every few months because they have holes in them. Check for mercury. Another thing with mercury is that they often have kind of pink fingertips. That's often a sign of heavy metals. If you look at your hands and the tips are very red. High lead, so that can also cause the same kind of behavior. They're often the kids who bite and who eat soil and eat things that they shouldn't be eating, like tree bark, and chew on the walls. Very labile mood again, and learning problems. So we know that high lead really affects your learning. Then there are kids who have food sensitivities. In particular, of course, the additives. I want every child to be on an additive-free diet. None of the E numbers are good for you. We have really good studies on the 102, the orange coloring, and 202, the preservative, sodium benzoate, potassium sorbate, potassium benzoate. Those we have studies on other ones as well. They are not made for our health. They're made to increase the shelf life of these foods and make them more attractive to children. Marketing specialists have found that if a child sees a bright orange lolly, they're preferred over a white lolly, so they make everything bright orange. But it does affect their brain the same way as a toxin. And one of the ways is that when you eat these things and the body sees them as a toxin, you immediately use up all the zinc you have available. And so you have a sudden drop in zinc, and then you become irritable. There's another group of kids who have bright red ears and red cheeks, and who also sweat at night. And they often get these things after they eat foods that are high in phenols. So those are tomatoes, berries, anything with lots of color, banana, oranges, mandarins, anything orange, red. And this is not, those foods obviously are healthy. It's healthy to eat an orange. But if you have a problem with your transsulfuration, which is the way that these things are metabolized, then you get the symptoms. And you can improve that over time by helping the body to do that transsulfuration better with diet, supplements, and probiotics. The typical gut dysbiosis that I already mentioned in kids who are really angry is Clostridia. So Clostridia, there's a lot of research on Clostridia now. We know that adults who are if they take too many antibiotics, they can die from Clostridia infections. And children, they don't usually get that sick, but if they have an overgrowth of Clostridia, it often makes them very angry and irritable. And there's also a connection between Clostridia and autism, but that's kind of separate. But in neurotypical children, it's more anger. And so if you have children who have really bad bowel motions, really stinky, it may be worthwhile testing for Clostridia, and if they have them, to treat them, either with probiotics or antibiotics or whatever is needed, depending on how bad it is. And then there's a group of kids who have that gluten sensitivity. I see a lot of children who are just irritable and always negative and everything, the glass is always half full, who have these antibodies to gluten. And when we take the gluten out of their diet, they improve within a week. And part of they of course also have the low zinc, and they also have food sensitivities and things like that. But the underlying first problem really was the gluten sensitivity. And what they did is, if you eat gluten, when you're sensitive to it, you have inflammation in your gut. And the inflammation makes the gut more permeable. If you think of the gut, if you think of my fingers as cells, they're supposed to be really tight together in the gut, so that the only thing that can go from the gut side to the blood is fully digested and actively transported through the cells. But if you have inflammation, so think of an inflamed elbow, it gets red and swollen and hot, and the swelling is just fluid. The cells don't grow bigger, it's fluid between the cells. And the same thing happens in the gut with inflammation. You have fluid between the cells, like that. And then things can go through, not fully digested, just by osmosis. They just flow through. And that causes then problems in the brain. So if you have a child with gluten sensitivity, you can do the blood test. Sometimes the blood test is negative, but we still think this kid, all they want is white bread and pizza and pasta. We'll just try the child on a different diet, and they often improve. We have, I don't know how many tests you have available here, but in New Zealand we can test for about 3 or 4 antibodies to gluten, but there are 20. So in America, there are new labs out now where you can actually test for the whole range of them, and you often find that some are positive, that in children who didn't have the positive test on the 2 or 3 that we have available. Another typical symptom in kids with gluten sensitivity is bad breath. So when parents come and say, my child just smells really bad, often that goes away within days of coming off the gluten. So quickly going to talk a bit about zinc. It's needed for over 200 different biochemical processes in the body. Very important for processing in the brain. For mood, frustration tolerance, for your taste buds as well. So if you don't have enough zinc, your taste buds don't work well, and you want to eat the same kind of foods every day. You don't eat a lot of variety. As you get the zinc into your system, that improves, and the children eventually eat a really great diet if they're offered it. What I often say is that in the first month of starting zinc supplementation, if you're low in it, your immune system improves, you get less sick. In the second month, your mood usually improves. And in the third, your taste buds improve and you start eating better. Now, about the immune system, I also wanted to just quickly mention about this child's skin infections. In New Zealand, there were studies done at the hospital about children with recurrent cellulitis. So that's infection of the skin. And we have very high rates of that in New Zealand. And they found that these kids are low in zinc. And if you give them zinc, they no longer get these recurrent infections. Okay, so, and skin healing is also affected by low zinc. So if you have lots and lots of open sores on your legs, these kids don't get bitten by 100 mosquitoes in one day. It's just that in other kids, the mosquito bites from last week have healed by now, and then you have maybe 2 or 3 new ones. But in the kids on low zinc, they accumulate. You get more and more and more, and they never heal. And last but not least, zinc is very important for detoxification. You need 4 molecules of zinc to get rid of 1 molecule of mercury. And we're all exposed to toxins every day. That's just living in our modern world. So we go through a lot of zinc. And zinc deficiency typically shows up as frequent infections, irritable children, poor memory, and no appetite, and of course, acne. You'll never forget that. Yep. So the American Academy of Pediatrics agrees now that food can affect behavior. So this is a really important study that changed that, and here's a list of the additives that you have in your handout. And I already talked about what a healthy diet is. It's really lots of water, no fizzy drinks. You don't even need juice unless it's homemade vegetable juice. And we've gone through all of that. And I've talked about the phenols already. And this is a whole long list of symptoms that it gives you. So these are the kids with the bright red cheeks and the red ears after they eat certain foods. And I talked about gluten as a neurotoxin. So we do know, the research on gluten used to be all on the gut, on celiac disease. So that's when you eat gluten, your body, your immune system makes antibodies against the gluten, and it cross-reacts with the gut and actually destroys it. And these kids are very skinny, they have tummy aches, they're iron deficient because they don't absorb any of their nutrients. But in the last 10 years, the research about gluten has shifted to neurological symptoms. So ataxia, where you can't walk straight because you're feeling unsteady on your legs, peripheral neuropathies, even seizures and migraines, dementia. So lots of neurological symptoms can be associated with that. I talked about the microbiome already. I only have 2 minutes to go, sorry. And I've given you some of the common gut flora overgrowths and their symptoms. So with yeast, kids usually become really silly and giggly if they eat sugar or fruit or juice or processed flours that are actually turned by the body into sugar very quickly. So if a child acts almost like they've drunk alcohol, think yeast. With streptococci, more the OCD, anxiety, to stop. And Clostridia, the anger. Okay, and then this, I've actually talked about all these things already. Now, for the child with the oppositional defiant behavior, what I did is I put him on a gluten and additive-free diet because he had the antibodies to gluten and he clearly reacted to orange coloring, and I think everybody should be on an additive-free diet. Put him on zinc and B6 and omega-3, and I also put him on SAMI. SAMI works really, really well for oppositional defiant children. And in the lifestyle, I sent the parents to the PPP, the Positive Parenting Program, not because they were bad parents, but because parents of children who are very challenging actually need extra tools in their toolbox to manage those children and not to lose it themselves. Because of course, if the parents get so angry that they lose it, then the child learns that that's the way to behave. We reduced media, no violent content, and lots of outdoor exercise. We know that the more time kids spend outdoors in green areas, the happier they are, and plenty of sleep. We talked about positive parenting, so there are a couple of different programs that work really well. And just simple things like rewarding the child every time they're good. And sometimes parents say, my child is never good. You say, well, I'm sure there will be one or two events in the day when they're actually doing something you ask them to do, and you have to seize those opportunities and reward them with a smile or a hug, or you can have an empty glass jar and put a marble in every time they do something nice. And they know that once a marble jar is full, they will be rewarded with something. So it's very important to break that cycle of negativity. Now, the outcome of this child was that the SAMI had an immediate effect, so immediately was less explosive and happier. And then within 4 weeks, the zinc came up, and the magnesium B6, and the omega-3, and he was much better. But whenever he had gluten, he was still grumpy. And when he had phenols, he got the red ears and became irritable. So we had him on a long-term treatment of zinc, B6, essential fatty acids, and the low gluten diet. He actually, after a while, was able to have gluten again, but it took several years of the gut to heal. So in summary, there are things, and from the biomedical perspective, we see the whole child. We treat with lifestyle, outdoor play, sleep, and positive parenting, reduction of stress, and with nutrition. So the macro and micronutrients have to be right. So the macro are the unprocessed whole foods, and the micronutrients are the minerals, in particular for these children, zinc, B vitamins, magnesium, vitamin D, and we address the gut flora, which is very, very important for your mood and behavior. And that's the talk, and I only went 1 minute over.